You've all heard of headsets by now. You know, the rectangular thing with a strap around it to mount on your head. Well, what if I told you there was another piece of technology that let users experience virtual reality with a much more interactive level? One that gave them the power of VR at their fingertips. Literally. Hello and welcome to Point of View. I'm your host Massimo, and I'll be taking you through the past, present, and future of virtual reality. In this final episode, I'm going to take you through the 80s, 90s, and the future within the new millennium. Our story continues with the glove. It's the 1980s and VR is about to boom in popularity. And not much has happened up until then, aside from a VR helmet used by the military and some more stereo vision glasses. But what happened next was huge. In 1982, the Sire gloves became the first pair of VR gloves ever made. They were wired to a computer that tracked hand movements, allowing gesture recognition. This meant that movements on screen corresponded to where your glove moved in real life. The world put on VR gloves and they weren't going to stop, because in 1985, one company made it their mission to put VR in the hands of the consumer. VPL Research Incorporated was the first company to ever sell VR headsets and gloves to the public, making VR more accessible to the average person. There wasn't much for everyday use, but one product stood among the rest, the Data Glove. Sure, not everyone had it, nor could they afford it, but it wasn't long until some of the biggest video game companies took a keen eye to the glove and its glory. This interest in VR resulted in a race to make the best VR product that money could buy, one that would have kids squealing with joy when they opened it up for the first time on Christmas morning. Or not. Alright, so let's skip ahead a little bit. It's 1989, and VR finally entered the world of video games after it caught the eye of none other than Nintendo, the video game giant. They worked tirelessly to recreate VPL's Data Glove into something that could change the gaming world forever. And so came the Power Glove, an accessory to the Nintendo Entertainment System, one of Nintendo's current big-ticket items at the time. This glove allowed users to play games using hand movements and a built-in controller on the wrist. This glove was revolutionary, but it had a problem. It was way too difficult for a kid to use. Nintendo wasn't trying to sell these button-filled, astronaut-sized gloves to NASA. Their target market was 10-year-olds who wanted to literally be able to punch and punch out. The glove was clunky, heavy, and probably should have been used in a lab. Unfortunately, Nintendo's Power Glove didn't do too well because of this, but it wasn't long until Sega saw the capabilities of VR, and they wanted in. It would be a few years until they had a product of their own to throw into the ring, and like Nintendo's Power Glove, it didn't do too well. Sega was smart enough to avoid making the mistake of trying to recreate another glove. It was the 90s after all. The glove was so last decade. Headsets were in the hot seat, and at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1993, Sega unveiled their first VR product, the Sega VR headset. It looked like something from RoboCop, a weird wraparound headset with a glowing red visor in front. And to be fair, it was just a prototype, and thank goodness it stayed that way. There were a ton of technical difficulties, not to mention the concern for kids bumping into things while playing games. Hey, did I mention there were only 4 games made? Sega's headset was a huge disappointment. So huge that it wasn't even released to the public. Although in 1994, they got a lot more attention with the release of their motion simulator arcade machine, the Sega VR1. This machine used a headset along with motion tracking to make the game move when you move. And it wasn't until this second invention that Sega finally saw their first glimmer of success, and Nintendo decided to strike back. This time, they were putting their heads in the game, but it didn't get any better from the glove incident. In 1995, Nintendo came back into the world of VR gaming with the Virtual Boy, a portable VR headset for playing 3D games. Finally, people were hyped to have a portable system for the first time, but it lacked a lot of things which made the experience terrible for the few who got to play it. The games were only in red and black, there were no software support if things blanked out, and this thing was not comfortable to use at all. Really uncomfortable. Neck pains, nausea, and non-stop headaches became the stakes of playing the Virtual Boy. They didn't look very comfortable either. Similar to the pairs of binoculars on the observation deck of Niagara Falls, this headset was a clunky red heap of plastic with a controller attached to it. Yeah, not the best idea. It was so bad that Nintendo decided to take it off the market a year later and never speak of it again. And so, the VR video game war between Nintendo and Sega coasted to a stop. And the rest of the 90s, well, they were pretty quiet when it came to VR. Aside from The Matrix, of course. How could I forget that? As for Nintendo and Sega's failed opportunities, well, they wouldn't be forgotten. Instead, they would be remembered as what not to do with VR. But don't worry, this taught big tech companies a lesson and inspired them to make VR into something a lot better in the 21st century. Fast forward to 2007 and Google creates Google Maps with the help of a 12-sided camera taking 360 images from a moving car. 3 years later, 18-year-old entrepreneur Palmer Luckey makes the first prototype of the Oculus Rift, raising nearly $2.5 million on a Kickstarter campaign, then being bought for $2 billion by Facebook. Once Oculus took off, every tech giant wanted their hands in the virtual cookie jar. Headsets were being made for almost every console, do-it-yourself kits were given to people in the form of cardboard, and smartphones can now be your own headset without having to buy one. That, however, is just a piece of what happened within the last decade, but there's way too much to tell. The rest is just a story for the future, and so our adventure comes to an end. So, you're probably asking, what comes next? The idea of a giant virtual world was interesting. An idea from the hit movie Ready Player One became the bane for Facebook's metaverse, which we're actually not too far from. Who knows? Maybe Apple's new $3,500 headset might turn a couple heads and beat Oculus at their own game for once. But that's a little too far ahead for me to tell. I want to thank you for listening to Point of View, and I hope you saw what virtual reality can really open our eyes to. Once again, I'm Massimo, and thanks for listening.